Over the past couple of years during the pandemic, we've not heard as much about global warming and climate change. However, we've been shocked by a lot of the floods and fires in British Columbia. Here in southern Alberta, we've had extreme heat and drought this past summer. These events are hard to experience and as well hard to forget. People look for answers during events such as these, and we question the source. Are they natural occurrences and cyclical weather patterns, or are they man-made? Joining me now to talk about some of the issues is the communications manager with the Calgary-based Friends of Science Society, Michelle Stirling. Michelle, thanks for joining us here on Bridge City News today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. First of all, can you give kind of a brief snapshot, a description as to what Friends of Science does?
Yes, Friends of Science is a small nonprofit. We're run by volunteers. We started in about 2000, around the time of Kyoto, and it's made up of retired and semi-retired professional geoscientists, earth atmospheric scientists, solar scientists, and professional engineers. And at the time that the group was founded, they were concerned about Kyoto, which is kind of a forerunner to the Paris Agreement of today. And so they were concerned that the science seemed very skewed and the economics would be devastating to Canada. So the group thought, well, we'll just put together some briefs and send them off to people in power and, change their mind with facts. But here we are 20 years later, still fighting the same fight, trying to get some open civil debate on climate and energy topics.
Well, let's talk a bit about your background, first of all. How did you get involved with Friends of Science?
I've always been involved in communications, and I was writing op-eds for the Red Deer Advocate at one point, and prior to that, I'd worked at Alberta Environment. I was tracking the tar sands campaign and saw that a lot of that was moving toward a climate influence, if you like. And so one of my former broadcast colleagues, an executive from the former ITV, contacted me and said, hey, you should get hold of Friends of Science. They can give you some of the climate change info. And by the way, maybe you would be a good PR person for them. So that's how it rolled out. And the rest is history.
Now, before we get into some of the environmental questions, I want to chat with you a bit about coal. As you know, coal mining is a major impact here in the southern Alberta economy for jobs, but a lot of people are also quite concerned when it comes to selenium making its way into the Oldman River, impacting our water quality here. Now, the NDP began to phase out our coal, but your group has a lot of information about how Alberta coal is actually not a major polluter. Can you explain?
Yes, well, we were quite opposed to the NDP coal phase out, largely because since I had worked at Alberta Environment, I knew that our air quality in Alberta is excellent most of the time. And we have very substantial environmental impact assessments for all these projects before anything goes ahead. And so, I think environmentalists try to paint the scenario as if they're the only ones defending the environment when, we had about 1,200 people working for Alberta Environment when I was there, many of them scientists. So, first of all, Alberta coal is very high quality. It's low sulfur, it's surface mineable. So that means that reclamation is quite easy to do. And some of the places that have been restored have been turned into very nice recreational areas. And also, it's really a hedge against what we're seeing in the world right now to have coal, which is basically price stable, and we own 800 years of it here in Alberta. Um, and to be abandoning that when we see natural gas prices are spiking worldwide, there's a supply problem. The UK people are facing thousands of pounds, dollars, of costs for their energy this year. Most people will be pushed into heat or eat poverty, and that's affecting us too. That energy crisis will hit us too. And what have we done? We've phased out our coal plants, which provide affordable, reliable power, and we have the energy supply here. And now we're buying coal power from Montana and Saskatchewan and putting another burden on taxpayers because that money leaves the province. And further to that, the irony is that many of the health unions were very adamant in the coal phase out campaign. But what does modern medicine entirely rely on? Electricity. And it needs affordable, reliable, high quality, meaning no dips and surges, because that will set all the equipment off. All that specialized equipment has to be calibrated. So, coal would be the ideal factor. And about 75% of the power in Alberta is used by industry as well. So it was an integral part of the Alberta advantage.
Michelle, last year we saw the town of Lytton, BC burn down to the ground. It was very tragic. And there have been a lot of forest fires in British Columbia and the atmospheric rivers, which brought a lot of rain floods. Certain voices are claiming this is due to climate change. What do you say about these events?
Well, the town of Lytton has sadly burnt down about 4 times before in history. So when people tell you that something is because of contemporary man-made climate change, first thing you should do is look at history and see if it's happened before. And the same with the floods. The biggest flood in the Sumas Valley, in the Fraser Valley area, was in 1894, and it has not been exceeded yet. So, the atmospheric rivers are associated with what's called the Pineapple Express, and it's a change in the jet stream where the subtropical jet stream picks up a lot of water from the ocean and carries it, literally like picking it up in a big aerial bucket and throwing it on land when it reaches landfall. And if you look historically, there's a Scientific American article on Sacramento where in 1861-62 they had 43 straight days of rain. And when the atmospheric river was coming in, the Aboriginal people who lived there saw what was coming and they headed for the hills. So obviously they were familiar with this phenomenon and it was nothing new. So, that doesn't mean that humans have no impact on climate change, but it definitely means that a carbon tax, building wind and solar farms, will not do anything to stop these kinds of events. We instead need to be prepared. And if we're building on a floodplain, we need to properly build those dike systems, and we have to build for the likelihood that there will be this kind of condition.
Of all of the climate change or global warming predictions from the government, have any actually come true?
No. Oh, no, none of them have come true. And really, what people need to understand is that the definition of climate change, according to the IPCC, is it's a change in the state of climate that can be identified by statistical means that occurs over a period of decades. So these are all singular events that we've been talking about. These are not decadal events where the same thing is happening year after year over decades. So that's not evidence of climate change. These are extreme weather events and they're integral to climate. We have a whole presentation on that by Dr. Kandekar on our website under our events. And we do have another report by Robert Lyman, who was a federal public servant for 27 years, and he was also a diplomat for 10 years. And he calls it When Climate Prophecy Fails, and showing that none of the prophecies support the claims of the climate emergency. And we have another report called A Confluence of Carbonbaggers, which shows that most of the big climate movement is related to people who want to establish cap and trade systems worldwide and make you pay for it.
So it's all about following the money, as my father used to say? Is that what it is?
Yes, that's a very, very big part of it. A very big part of it. And one of the challenges, of course, in predicting what will happen is that the climate community, the scientists, use what are called climate models. They're not like model toys where you maybe get a submarine and it's 1/32 of the size or 3/400 of the size of an actual submarine. These are computer models, they're simulations. And the IPCC itself said in one of their early reports, and let me just read this quote: "In climate research and modeling, we should recognize that we're dealing with a coupled, non-linear, chaotic system, and therefore long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible." So, if it were a linear system, it would be like dominoes. You could say, oh, there's a whole bunch of human-caused global warming from this plant, and boom, 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 over here, we're seeing the effect of climate change because of that. But it's not. It's a very complex system with many complex dynamic interactions of the sun, the ocean, etc. So I sent you a little diagram that Professor Henri Masson made, that he's a complex systems expert, and it gives you a sense of, wow, so many elements. Who could predict the outcome?
Michelle, we recently had a professor from the University of Lethbridge talking about seeing the ice shelf shrinking in Canada's Arctic, but there's also been information that the ice pack is growing in the Arctic. So which is it?
Well, the Arctic is always a kind of a funny place to explore in terms of the sea ice, because it's really like a big ice cube sitting on top of moving currents, warm and cool currents. And so we have a short video on our website, on our YouTube channel, with Dr. Ian Clark, who discusses the Holocene hypsothermal and how about 8,000 years ago, the Arctic was ice-free and all the polar bears were fine. So obviously some of these things are cyclical. And then we have another number of commentaries in our report rebutting the federal government's report on climate change, the 2019 one. Our report is called Climate Change Your Mind. And in that, we refer to a study that shows that in the Arctic in the 1930s, when CO2 was much lower than now, it was 4.6 degrees Celsius warmer up there than from 1981 to 2010. So obviously these are cyclical events. They're affected by different factors. And one of those factors may be related to underwater geothermal activity. That would be like submarine volcanoes or subliminal volcanoes. And we have some posts by Professor Wis Yim, who shows that, you know, like right now there's the big Cumbra Vieja eruption in La Palma in the Canary Islands. Well, that kind of volcanic activity way down there may lead to heat going into the Gulf Stream, which then goes up into the Arctic. And that would affect the sea ice variability. So, you know, people could have a look at that. So again, you know, there's so many factors involved, like, you know, a carbon tax isn't going to save the polar bears. In fact, they're doing quite well.
Michelle, the energy sector has been hurting for quite some time in our country, and especially here in Alberta. Would you consider the efforts to keep Alberta petrochemicals out of the market part of efforts to protect our environment, or do you see maybe a different motivation?
Oh, I see it as a green trade war. There's no doubt in my mind. I think if you look at Matthew Nisbet's work, he's a professor of communications. He's followed a number of the major philanthropies. Many of them are based in the States, but some are in Switzerland and Europe. And they've been pumping at least $600 million a year into environmental groups. And these environmental groups, of course, have claimed, oh, you know, that the tar sands is a carbon bomb and stuff like that. And I think that it's been very useful for the renewables industry to use the portrayal of the Alberta oil sands, which look pretty dirty when you see that aerial view. You know, that this is a representation of dirty energy, whereas wind and solar is presented as if it's clean, when in fact wind and solar is made from tons of coal, lots of natural gas, and barrels of oil. It couldn't exist without oil, gas, and coal, but it's been a useful marketing tool. So to my mind, you know, we're in the top 10 exporters of oil in the world. Our competitors are just laughing all the way to the bank while we shoot ourselves in the foot.
Michelle, anthropomorphic climate change sounds kind of like a strange phrase, but can you really explain what it means? And what has your research shown if this is in fact a reality?
Yeah, anthropomorphic or anthropogenic climate change is real. We do affect climate. And I think some of the more grounded information would come from Roger Pielke Sr., who is a climate researcher in the States. And he's written a lot about how humans affect climate through land use, like agriculture, urban heat island, building cities, water diversion, and deforestation. Now, these are not really properly accounted for. And also, these are things that we need to do in order to live. I think you'll know about the urban heat island if you've ever driven in from the country to the city or vice versa. You can often see a 5 or 6 degrees Celsius change in temperature, um, just in it because the cities retain heat. Now, that's been a very controversial element in the claims of global warming because many of the temperature monitors are near these cities. And so the temperature is contaminated by the urban heat island, which is not reflective of what the temperature is elsewhere. So it is a real thing. We do contribute to climate change and to warming, but Mother Nature, in our view, is much more influential. In our view, it's the sun that is the main driver of climate change, certainly not carbon dioxide. And we can see that because recently carbon dioxide levels have risen considerably, but temperatures have not. So there's a grand divergence there. And also, if you check the weather balloon and University of Alabama Huntsville satellite data, you find that this is where the temperature is, while the models are predicting a very steep increase in temperature. But this is not happening. The reality is that temperatures are flatlining or even declining.
Michelle Stirling with Friends of Science, thanks for joining us today from Calgary.
My pleasure. Thank you.